Hello everyone, my name is Sophie and today I am joined here with Neil. Today we will begin series 2 of our podcast. Today is all about zero carbon emissions.
Most jurisdictions set their plans for meeting carbon neutrality or net carbon zero after the COP26 meeting in December 2021. Now, most organisations, most national health services have made those plans, and each national health department is going to start asking medical device manufacturers to do their part in moving towards carbon neutrality.
Yes, and it is certainly clear to us that the UK NHS has the most ambitious timescales. The NHS is responsible for 20 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions annually. 62% of these emissions is linked to the supply chain, with at least 2 million tonnes of CO2 emissions being linked to medical device manufacturers. We have the NHS Net Zero Roadmap. The NHS have set their Net Zero Roadmap, which runs up to 2040. This requires that by April 2024, all medical device manufacturers have to supply a carbon reduction plan and then report periodically on their progress. Now I will pass you to Neil, who will now tell us what goes on in a carbon reduction plan.
The term net zero means that we have to reduce our carbon emissions to the level that can be offset by our carbon sinks, how we absorb carbon from the atmosphere, so that the overall effect on the atmosphere is net zero. This is a little bit like a seesaw arrangement where we're trying to reduce our emissions at the same time increase the generally good things that we can do in absorbing carbon through carbon sinks. Typically we have three scopes of emissions. The first scope are the fuels that we use directly. So that might be the gas or oil that we use for heating our factories, perhaps the oil that go into company vehicles to make them run. Secondly, we have the indirect sources of energy. That might be things like electricity, which we buy from the grid. It may have come from oil, it may have come from natural gas, or indeed it may be renewable. So it's about selecting our energy providers so that we gain any renewable energy and thereby can also reduce our carbon footprint. Lastly, it's about understanding the full supply chain. We're responsible for the products that we buy, what their carbon footprint is, and we're also responsible for what we insist the next stages of the supply chain are through our distribution process and how we actually get the product all the way to the hospital. So we've got the full chain to manage. What we need to try and do is to reduce our emissions to the point where this seesaw starts to balance with the carbon sink. So carbon sink are things like soils, forests, oceans, and carbon capture. We've yet to get carbon capture working, and there's a finite limit to the number of trees we're going to be able to plant. So realistically, we've got to make a dramatic change in our carbon emissions if we're going to be able to get down to net zero just through offsetting against our carbon sinks. But by 2040, we have to make this seesaw come into balance. Our carbon reduction plan is how we do that. The first part of a carbon reduction plan is that we have to determine what our base year is going to be. Now that might be 2023, or that might not be totally reasonable. If you're significantly affected by other events, if you're still suffering effects from the outbreak of the Ukraine war, from the pandemic even, then maybe you need to go back to the last normal year, the last year before the pandemic. Maybe you go back to 2019 as your base year, when you were doing the same amount of travel you expect to be doing, you were doing normal things in running your factory, having the same fuel consumption that you expect to be having, producing the same quantity of goods. And that's going to be different for every manufacturer. Some manufacturers, it may be better to start with 2023. Other manufacturers may need to go back to 2019 to set their base year. It needs to be a year that you can realistically use as what you were doing before you started moving down this net carbon zero route. In order to establish your carbon footprint for that base year and to set your targets for future years, you have to come up with a way of quantifying your carbon footprint. So turning all your consumptions of energy, direct, indirect, and through the greater supply chain into tons of carbon emitted. And that may well mean that you're looking to use some sort of database or information provided by somebody else. The issue then is that your carbon reduction plan is only going to be as good as that information is accurate and remains accurate. So you need to select a method of measurement which is going to last for the full time of your carbon reduction plan. We then need to do a methodical analysis of our actions. What can we do to reduce our emissions? What can we do to offset the emissions we're still making through carbon capture, through different sinking methodologies? And the technology on this will change over the next 20 years, but we have to make some predictions. It may also be that we can cooperate with competitors and other companies in the field to see what best practice is. And maybe this is something where we're going to need to work together to get to best practice, because these are really very challenging targets, and it's particularly challenging if each company is trying to work to their own targets individually. We may need to download it onto our suppliers, and those suppliers may be supplying other companies, not just ourselves. So it may need a degree of consistency here, and this is where working together, maybe working with the trade organisation, becomes a benefit. Once we've established our baseline year, set our targets for the future that will bring us down to net carbon zero by 2040 or whatever our particular national government requires, we then need to start reporting on our progress. Typically, we're reporting on our progress every year or two. How well are we doing? And we may need to declare changes to projects, changes to things that we're doing that will affect the size of our business, and therefore how close we're getting to a net carbon zero. Lastly, in the end, we're probably going to be asked for some form of third-party certification that we really have done what we've set out to do. And that may be an ongoing basis, or that may be just keeping good records so they can be reviewed at the end. And we have to determine how we're going to do that, and that becomes part of our carbon reduction plan as well. As with any plan, the most difficult bit is always the last 20%. It's relatively easy to make those first 80% of savings that can get us down to 20% of our carbon's emissions. The difficult bit is always the last bit, getting that to balance, finding a way to sync after we've surrounded our factory with every tree we can possibly plant on the land outside. What else can we do? That last bit of carbon that comes from our suppliers, how on earth can we reduce that further? It's the last 20% that we're really going to struggle with. There are a lot of easy wins to be made in the first few years. Go to an electricity provider who has a higher percentage of sustainability sources in their generation. It becomes a lot more difficult as we go on down this route.
Okay, Neil, I think that is a perfect place to end it, because I'm sure we'll come back to this topic later on in weeks to come. Thank you guys for watching.